مساء الخير. مساء الخير عليكم. أنا اسمي سو عبد العاطي. أنا نائبة المديرة في مركز حلول للسياسات البديلة. إحنا مشروع بحثي مقره الجامعة الأمريكية. إحنا بنقدم أبحاث ودراسات عن حلول للسياسات البديلة، حلول للسياسات العامة. برحب بيكم وبطلب من حضراتكم بس من فضلكم جميعا تحطوا موبايلاتكم على سايلنت أو تطفوها احتراما بس للسادة الضيوف. أنا هسيب اللقاء تحت إدارة الأستاذة هبة صالح مراسلة فاينانشال تايمز في مصر. اتفضلي.
Hello everyone. Welcome to this discussion on development at a time of crisis with our guest, Dr. Alfredo Saad Filho, Professor of Political Economy and International Development. في ترجمة للي محتاجها في برا سماعات مش كده؟ Okay. طيب, let me resume. Thank you very much for coming, and we have this discussion today on development at a time of crisis with our guest, Dr. Alfredo Saad Filho, Professor of Political Economy and International Development at King's College London. A quick introduction. Dr. Filho is an economist who has researched and written extensively about the development models promoted by the IMF and World Bank, and about pro-poor alternatives to these models. His research areas also include industrial policy, neoliberalism, democracy, alternative economic policies, and inflation, among many other topics. So let's start. And Dr. Filho, welcome. I'd like to ask you about the current situation we are in. This is, like our title, a world in crisis. We're just emerging from a pandemic. There's also a major war on, and it has impacted economies across the globe. It sent many countries to the IMF seeking loans, promising reforms, and I would like to ask if this model is going to be their salvation. The recipe will include austerity, currency devaluation, fiscal measures. Is this going to help, or are we doomed?
So is the microphone working? It's too low. Is it better now? Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Hiba. Just before I address the question, I'd like to thank AUC and APS, and particularly my colleagues here who have worked so hard to make this opportunity possible for me to be here exchanging ideas with you. I'm really grateful for this. Rabab El-Mahdi, who can't be here with us today, Soha Abdelati, Shaza Abdul Samad, Judy Kodaimati. Thank you so much for all your work on this. It's a privilege for me. It's a particular privilege to be at AUC. AUC is a beacon of rationality in a world in crisis. It's a source of inspiration around the world. So I'm really honored to be here today. This is a world in crisis, as you have mentioned. It's a world in multiple and overlapping crises. A crisis in the global economy that persists since at least 2008, and that has led to a very prolonged and unprecedentedly prolonged stagnation centered in the large economies in the West, the advanced capitalist economies in the West. A crisis in politics, in the realm of politics, that has led to the erosion of democracy and, more recently, the rise of new forms of spectacular authoritarian politics and a rise of new forms of fascism in the world today. A world in crisis in the realm of health. We all went through and had to experience the COVID-19 pandemic that caused millions of losses, of deaths, and huge costs around the world. and evidently a crisis of the environment in the background with climate change and implications for all aspects of our mode of living and implications for life as we understand it. So this is a world in turmoil. And for developing countries in particular, developing countries are always more vulnerable. Developing countries are the shock absorbers of the global economy. Developing countries bear the weight of the crises of themselves and the weight of the crises of the richer countries that adjust themselves by transferring costs and losses to the poorer countries in the global south. So it has been like this for a very long time. And the policies that have been adopted around the world in response to these crises, we have to be honest about this, they have not worked. And this is a matter of contemplating, it's a matter of experience. Contemplate the crises that we have experienced for a very long period of time. In the case of the advanced economies in the West, since 2008. In the case of developing countries, since at least the early 1980s, if not the late 1970s, almost incessantly, countries experiencing across the global south, with few exceptions, especially centered in East Asia, lower and lower rates of economic growth. In the living memory of people who are with us today, people who will remember periods of much faster growth in the past, much faster rates of employment generation, much more significant experiences of wages rising and standards of living increasing, and then suddenly it doesn't happen anymore. Why doesn't it happen anymore? I'm from Brazil originally, and I remember when I was little, the country growing every year at about 7% per annum, and then with employment being available and people being able to satisfy their needs, with all the problems of a much poorer economy than it is now, with all the problems of the type of government that we had at the time. But you at least could sense that there were opportunities for improvement. Now these opportunities for improvement are being lost. Lost in developing countries, lost in advanced countries as well. Notice the problem. It's not a problem that will be resolved with devaluations of the currency. Notice the problem. For the first time in the history of global capitalism, go back 400 years, for the first time we have now around the world, a generation of young people that will do worse than their parents did economically. This is the first time in the history of capitalism that this happens. You can no longer say, I as a parent will make sacrifices and I will have a hard life, but I accept that because my children will do better than I am doing. I do this for my kids so that they will live better lives. You can't say that anymore because in general, for the majority of people in the advanced economies in the West and across the developing countries in the global South, this is no longer true. Your children will do worse than you did. Now, how can you legitimize an economic system that delivers this kind of perverse outcome? How can you validate the political systems that impose those economic solutions that are no solutions to problems, but they perpetuate and aggravate problems? So the policies that are being... So neoliberalism, one step back. Neoliberalism as a global economic and political system, as a current configuration of international capitalism, is for the first time in history a universal economic system. For the first time in history, you have the same economic policies being followed in the center and in the periphery of the global economy. It wasn't like this. If you think back 50 years, if you think back 100 years, if you think back 200 years, the policies in Western Europe and North America were always different from the policies implemented in the periphery, in the colonies, and so on. Now the policies are the same, and they don't work in the center, they don't deliver prosperity, and they don't deliver prosperity in the periphery either.
Right.
So, sorry, I'm deviating from your question. Let me just wrap it up, and I'll give it back to you. When the International Monetary Fund, and they have made self-criticisms several times since at least 2005 and recognized failings in their policy prescriptions and policy implementation and promised to change. They haven't changed. The rhetoric has changed, the substance of the policies is exactly the same. Those policies have not delivered prosperity. And the we can discuss this in detail, the interpretation of the causes of the crisis and the recipe of the policies to be implemented in response to those crises, they are both wrong, and the experience, the practical experience of well over 200 adjustment programs implemented across the world since the early 1980s is that they do not deliver sustained rapid growth, employment generation, distribution of income, or any other one of the outcomes that are quite rightly expected by people, especially in developing countries. So I am not hopeful. I'm not despondent and I'm not desperate, but I'm not hopeful.
Right. Let me go back to what you've just said and ask you, why hasn't neoliberalism delivered? What's wrong with it? And how do we reverse this, or what is an alternative model?
I can give you a short answer and I can give you a very long answer. I'll start with the
Medium
short answer. I'll start with the short answer and then I'll go to the longer answer.
Yes.
Neoliberalism is a form of organization of the economy and of the political system that is centered around the financialization of production and the financialization of social life. Everything revolves around finance. The way you value economic enterprises is on the basis of short-term profitability as measured by the financial institutions, by the stock markets, by the banks that lend money to your business. The way you value your choices in life, should I go to university or not? Is it worth paying the fees in relation to the employment that I am going to find? That's a financial form of calculation. It wasn't the case before. When education could be provided for free, as a human right, as a right of citizenship, as your right as a member of society, then the calculation would be different. Am I interested? Am I going to contribute to society? The logic of functioning is different. The way in which societies have coped with social reproduction in times of neoliberalism has become increasingly dependent on bank loans, credit cards, credit to do things that in the past could be provided for by the state, but the state doesn't do that anymore because policies have changed, the social welfare provision has changed, etc. So financialization penetrates every aspect of life, and it is conducive to low economic growth. Why? Because financial institutions are geared, that's the way they execute their operations, geared to short-term profitability. Short-term profitability measured every quarter, profitability measured every month, it is incompatible with structural economic policies, with long-term economic transformation, with the shift in society that is needed in countries in accelerated process of development. So financialization is not compatible with long-term economic growth. It is also not compatible with distribution of income, because finance is controlled by those who already own resources, and they captured the majority of the profits from financial operations. So financialization, finance that is already the sector of the economy, traditionally all over the world, that pays the highest compensation, the highest salaries, is also a sector that captures most of the benefits from economic activity taking place in all areas of the economy. So financialization leads to tendentially low growth rates and concentration of income at the same time. So it is a drain on resources, not a source of dynamism, but a drain on resources. So neoliberalism doesn't, that's my short answer, right? Neoliberalism does not lead to rapid growth because of that. But then there will be other aspects that we can talk about it if it is interesting. Financialization in neoliberalism distort the political system. Financialization and neoliberalism create vulnerabilities in social provision that we saw in the COVID pandemic when states had difficulty responding to the health emergency. Financialization undermines climate stability because of short-termism as well. So we can look at all aspects and dimensions of financialization and neoliberalism, and they have tended to be perverse.
Is this now the system that you described that is driving economies, driving political decision-making all over the world, is this something escapable, or have we reached a point of no return?
No, it is escapable. It is. Because every political system, every form of social organization depends ultimately on social consent. It depends on a set of institutions that maintain its coherence. but it depends on social consent, and social consent to a large extent, well, depends on ethical value judgments from society, but also on the capacity of that economic and political system to respond to the challenge that it itself poses. As the challenges and expectations that other people not directly involved in the system expect. We all expect jobs. We all expect a way to live with decency and to satisfy our own needs, the needs of our families, the needs of those people who are close to us. We expect to see a society that in some way reflects our values. But the system also poses challenges to itself. We are going to deliver X, Y, Z. If we look at IMF adjustment programs, we are going to reach those targets. And if you systematically don't reach those targets, if systematically the political system and the economic strategy adopted by the country is unable to satisfy the standards of a decent life as they are expected by the majority of the population, you lose legitimacy cumulatively. You might not notice it for sometimes years, but at some point people will say, oh, we're tired of waiting. This does not work. The conclusion, the reasoned conclusion we have reached is that this approach does not work. And this has been experienced in different countries in different ways, of course.
Can I ask you to say a bit more about the political impact? Because we still have people in major economies still electing conservative governments, right-wing governments. The kind of thinking which wants to speak more about the public good, about social goods, about the anti-financialization, does not seem to be advancing, especially in the major Western economies.
You are correct with exceptions, fortunate exceptions in my view. But there are experiences of growth of anti-systemic movements from the point coming from a left-wing perspective attached to projects of greater distribution, empowerment of communities, recognitions of rights, etc. The experience of Bernie Sanders in the United States, the experience of the Black Lives Matter in the movement in the United States was fascinating social movement, the most important social movement to emerge in the United States in at least half a century. The experience of the Jeremy Corbyn movement in the UK, the experience of Podemos in Spain, the experience of Syriza in Greece, experience of the Workers' Party in Brazil, etc. There are many experiences. What they do have in common, as you quite rightly pointed out, is that all these movements were defeated, at least in the short term, absolutely comprehensively defeated in the goals that they had set out for themselves. And this is a problem. Evidently, this is a problem. But their achievements and that experience that they had, it shows to us, first of all, that there is demand, expectation, and resonance for that type of political project and political alternative. And there are seeds, in some cases, of particular movements that achieved state power for a limited period of time. There are experiences that achieved success and that we can contemplate retrospectively and say, wow, we can do something good. Governments can make a difference. Political intervention, political participation, political involvement, contributions in the political domain can make a difference to the ways in which we live, and that's a very important lesson. And we can hope, and I think it's a reasonable hope, that on the basis of those experiences, new social movements will emerge in different ways. We can't anticipate that, will emerge with experience and more capacity to succeed in the future. And that intervention is even more necessary because the crisis of the dominant system is becoming deeper. And so where are we going that way?
Is this a place where we can speak about Brazil and Brazil's recent election? Is this a turning against right-wing economic policy?
So with apologies, the translators are struggling because I speak too fast. so let me try and speak slowly. If I start speaking too fast again, could someone please raise your hands desperately like this, and then I'll slow down temporarily. I'd love to speak about Brazil. So as I mentioned, I'm originally from Brazil, and I was very heartened by the electoral success of President Lula in the last presidential elections. That was an extremely important election for Brazil, with implications at a global level. It was not the first time, but it was a very significant time that a far-right political leader who had been elected previously was defeated in the polls. And it was Jair Bolsonaro, the previous president of Brazil, was defeated by a democratic coalition with an anti-fascist character, which was the political alliance that former President Lula could put together with a tremendous talent that he has for political activity. Lula is, in my opinion, and I've written many papers criticizing Lula for all sorts of reasons. Lula is the most important political leader of our generation. He is a person of extraordinary ability to build coalitions, to bridge divergences, to bring people together. And he was the only political leader in Brazil who could have achieved what was achieved. It was an extraordinary triumph. Now, his electoral victory and then the very strong and very correct response to the attempted coup on the 8th of January, when groups of people aligned with former President Bolsonaro stormed the presidential palace, Congress, and the Supreme Court. It was an absurd circus, what they did, but it was a threat to the institutional stability in the country. The response of the presidency was very correct and very strong. That gives hope that it is possible to maintain the stability of this democratic and anti-fascist coalition and to govern to the benefit of the majority of the population around a program of redistribution and a program that slows down, if not reverses, some aspects of neoliberalism in Brazil. So I'm very hopeful. Right. It's one of the few political successes that genuinely democratic forces have achieved in recent times.
Is it going to be possible for him to implement his program, or do you expect a lot of resistance? What will the limitations be?
Limitations will be very severe, and it's not clear. Now, what was the program of Lula is a murky concept, because the electoral campaign was around the defeat of Jair Bolsonaro. So there wasn't a very clear program coming out of the coalition around Lula. But it is understood that it will involve the restoration of social benefits, the improvements in the welfare state in Brazil, a restoration of health, protection of minorities, increases to the minimum wage, etc. A shift towards a more dynamic, domestically driven economy. It will be very challenging to do that. The goals are modest, but they will be very difficult to achieve for two reasons. The first reason is that the international environment is very adverse. It's adverse for everybody, but the global economy is not prosperous. And Lula was a very successful president. Last time around, he was president twice between 2003 and 2010. He was re-elected. But last time, there was the global commodity boom. And Brazil benefited enormously as a major commodity, primary commodity exporter. Brazil benefited enormously from that, and the government used those resources wisely through social programs, through the building up of a welfare state, a health system, schools, etc. There were fascinating experiences. I can't, if you allow me. My cousin's husband was a government official in the Amazon, and I went to visit there, and he said to me, look, this is a rural area. It's all farms here. But every morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, there will be a bus that will go to every single farm, pick up the child, take them to school. And in the afternoon, the bus will take them back. That is amazing. This is correct. This is good. Every child goes to school. This was achieved. Electrification. People didn't have electricity down in the Amazon. And then the transmission towers were built. They're massive works of engineering because the Amazon is a wild region with massive rivers. It's an absolutely extraordinary thing that was done to electrify households. Lost in the middle of the forest. Huge cost per household. It's not like electrifying a city that is relatively cheap per capita in the sense that the households are very concentrated. That is the middle of the forest. So significant successes were achieved. This time, there is no engine in the global economy because there is no global commodity boom, there is a crisis in the West, economic growth. China is Brazil's biggest trading partner. China's economic growth has been decelerating, so it will be difficult. And then there are the domestic blockages as well. There's very little room for additional fiscal spending, although the government has been trying to improve on that. There is little room for domestic credit because households are already very heavily indebted. There's some space to increase the minimum wage and then create more demand from the poor, but how much is not very clear. So there is some room for maneuver, but it will be very difficult for the government to deliver on its commitments.
Let me ask you about governments in our region or economies in our region, because and other economies that have had to go to the IMF because of the fallout from the Ukraine war, because of the increase in oil prices, commodity prices. Governments are overstretched. Is this a time when, is there anything they can do other than go to the IMF, given that they are in a crisis?
It is very difficult to, after a crisis has started, it is very difficult to consider, by definition, you have very limited room for maneuver. Developing countries, at all times, they have to be very mindful that they do not issue global currency. So a country like the United States or the European Union or Japan, they issue currency that is accepted around the world, so they have a lot more flexibility in terms of their fiscal policy and a lot more space to adopt policies that are convenient for themselves, and they have a lot more space to consume more than they produce, particularly the case of the United States. The UK is a bit of a mixed case there. But a country like Brazil or most other countries in the developing world, I would guess that this would include Egypt as well, these countries cannot allow themselves to get into a position of running a very large current account deficit. If you run a very large current account deficit, you have to cover this deficit in some way, and that way is going to have to be, you have to borrow, or you have to sell state assets and try to bring in foreign buyers, or you have to try and attract foreign investment, but all those sources are potentially volatile. If you are in that position, you need to come out of that vulnerability. Once the crisis has already happened, you've run out of depleted your foreign exchange reserves, then it is very difficult to think of costless alternatives to come out of the crisis. It will be better if it can be avoided, if going to the IMF can be avoided, because that ties you down to an economic program that is very rigid, very inflexible, with political conditionalities, not just economic conditionalities, with political conditionalities that will limit enormously the policy space available to governments. So I think the general lesson from previous experiences would be try to avoid external vulnerability through the current account deficit. But then once the crisis has hit, try to keep the conditionalities as light touch as possible to preserve policy space and think of alternatives that will prevent the crisis from recurring in the future through productivity growth, new export industries, competitivity in selected areas. But simply through devaluation and expecting that the magic of the market will take you out of the crisis, that won't happen. Right. The global experience that it won't happen.
Right. Let me take you to the environment. You mentioned the environment, you mentioned climate change. And I gather from what you said that you don't believe that the world as it's constituted is able, without any sort of major overhaul of its economic systems, of actually addressing this really big threat, and we probably don't have time.
I think you're correct on both counts. First, we don't have much time. Calculations of the global carbon budget, so how much carbon can we emit in order to achieve the targets of the Paris deal, are essentially lost at this point, much earlier than was feared. And the track that we are on will be for global warming of between 4 and 6 or 4 and 7 degrees by the end of the century. By the end of the century, if you say these words, it looks very distant. No, by the end of the century is the lifetime of children who are already with us today. They will live in a world that could well be inconceivably different, unrecognizable for us. That is absolutely catastrophic. The current economic and political system and the current global institutions cannot address the threat of climate change. And I think it's time for us to recognize that. If you look at the policy debates that have taken place since Rio 1992, but even before that, they show that current institutions, global institutions and domestic institutions, are not able to address the problem of climate change. They do not have the interest, they do not have the determination, they do not have the autonomy, and they do not have the drive to address climate change. So this will not happen unless we make fundamental changes to global institutions and to the ways of functioning of the global economy. We will not be able to avert catastrophe by the end of this century. It's a very simple choice, and it's very clear and it's very urgent from our point of view as citizens of this world.
Right. Let me ask you about something else that you have written about, which is developmental authoritarians. We're seeing this in Turkey, seeing it in India, probably in other places. Is this a phenomenon that is an outcome of the current international economic model?
It is. It is an outcome, and it is not just a phenomenon of developing countries, it's a phenomenon of advanced economies as well. And we notice Italy or the United States or the UK, with all the trappings of parliamentary democracy, an incredibly top-heavy and authoritarian government there as well. What you have in the background is a global economic system, a global neoliberal economic system that does not deliver gains to the majority of the population. Quite the contrary, a global economic system that has decomposed professions, that has demolished industries that existed before and that were viable before, that has transferred manufacturing capacity around the globe and concentrated it in particular regions, especially in East Asia, and deindustrialized a good part of the rest of the world. An economic system that demolished professions, that destroyed opportunities of employment, not just domestically, but in the domestic private sector, but in the domestic public sector as well, with the retrenchment of the state, privatizations, etc. So for people who depend on a wage, neoliberalism has in general been a very negative experience. The sociological consequence of this has been a sense of social disintegration in different societies as an impact, as a consequence of neoliberalism. No growth, social disintegration at the same time. And then a political vacuum that emerged. Traditional political debates about fundamental questions in society can no longer take place because neoliberalism and the economic policies of neoliberalism cannot be questioned. So even in democratic political systems, these political systems are evacuated, they are sterilized, because it is not possible to present, as you could in the past, alternative economic platforms. And those alternative economic platforms cannot be voted on because only one voice can be heard. Tinges of neoliberalism, slightly different approaches to the management of neoliberalism, but not sensible alternatives to it. And the consequence of this is a devaluation of even open political systems, but also despair. Because people who lost out economically through neoliberalism and its social consequences, these people are disempowered, not just, and these are many, many millions of people, they are disempowered not just in the economic domain, but also voiceless. Because the institutions of the state and the political organizations that would be responding, and the trade unions, community organizations that would be responding to their needs, cannot respond to them, are not interested in their views, and their views are substantive, their views are important. So the consequence of these crises is political instability that has been polarized by these authoritarian political leaders. Now, if you as an individual, you have no agency, you have no voice, then the tendency is to project your agency, your voice, your capacities onto a leader who comes from outside and says, imagine Donald Trump as a typical example, who says, I am here to resolve your problems. Vote for me and then go home. I will resolve your problems for you. But when I reach power, what is the first thing that Donald Trump does when he is elected president? A tax reform that favors the rich and penalizes the poor, followed by a succession of measures to dismantle the capacities of the US state, even to support his own political base. So and this is systematic, it's across the board, how do these political leaders then survive if their measures undermine their own voting base? They survive by creating conflict. It's a politics of constant, continuous conflict and the regeneration of disputes within society and between your society and societies abroad. It's a politics of conflict, it's a politics of grievance that generates and perpetuates frustration, and that leads to, in circumstances in which we live, leads to the advancement of new forms of authoritarian politics and fascism. This is an extremely dangerous development at the level of the global economy. And I worry that in developing countries with state systems that are much more fragile than in the advanced countries, the threat is even bigger.
I'll ask you one more question and then we will take questions from the audience. And we've been describing a situation that is very grim, and the prognosis that seems to be pessimistic for the future. But let me ask you if there are any countries, any examples that you can mention, something that's happening, that is current, of more positive economic policies that are not guided by the international model that we see everywhere. Mm-hmm. Has anyone escaped?
Oh no, yes, countries have escaped, and I'll give you two examples, but centered in the region that I know best, which is Latin America. Right. If you look at the distribution of income around the world in the past 40 years, distribution of income has worsened almost everywhere, with one significant exception, and that is Latin America in the early 2000s. In Latin America in the early 2000s, the distribution of income actually improved. Not by very much, but it improved a little bit. And that is because of the administrations of the so-called pink tide. Across the region, social democratic governments, reformist governments of different characters managed to implement policies, in most cases, non-seriously confrontational policies that were successful. So the lesson that we can take from that, well, two lessons we can take from that. One is that politics matters. The type of government you have can make a difference. And the other is that even very moderate policies, not expensive policies, but programs of transfer programs, social transfer programs, like the Bolsa Familia program in Brazil, for example, they cost generally less than 0.5% of GDP, and they make an enormous difference to the well-being of the poorest members of society. So that works. It is possible. Without creating major political turmoil, it is possible to make a difference. And then more recently, again, in the case of Latin America, governments that coming out of countries, several countries, not just Brazil, but other countries too, coming out of experiences of administrations situated quite far on the right, and then electing governments that are very different in political character and implementing economic policies with great difficulty, with a global scenario that is very adverse, but that are better than the policies that were implemented before. So there is space for hope. And there are other positive experiences in other parts of the world as well. So I am very alarmed. And in terms of global warming, I'm very frightened. But I'm also optimistic that there is space and that we have the tools to react. We have the tools to create a future that is better than the past and the experiences that we have had before. They do not have to be repeated. So I am optimistic in that sense.
Thank you. Let's take your questions. Okay, there's a gentleman there. Are there microphones? Soha? Are there... حضرتك أيوه.
Hernando de Soto once came to Egypt and was interviewed on television, and he said, you don't need to go to the IMF to get a loan. You can go to your slum areas and legitimize it and give them property rights and land rights and legitimize their business and give them water, electricity, and they're a gold mine of money. Would that be a good option?
Shall we take a few and then what do you prefer?
No, it's up to you.
Okay, we'll take another one there. اتفضل حضرتك.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Alfredo. In your opinion, how can we make a development here in Egypt? Especially, we haven't excellent education or a scientific research here. Especially another, we are a mountains of loans and the poverty increasing from 28 to about 60%. It's no crisis, it's a catastrophe. Thanks in advance.
Can we take a third and then the answer? هانية, دكتورة هانية.
Thank you, Hiba. Hi. I wanted to ask you about the relationship between nation and global capital, a relationship which is uncomfortable in Marxist economics, but you've been invoking governments a lot and change at the level of the nation state. And I'm wondering what is the dynamic whereby this change can impact global trends, or is it destined to be to remain localized? Thank you.
Okay, shall we have the answers and then we have some more questions?
Okay, I will be brief. De Soto, as people know, De Soto became very famous about, 20-something years ago with the argument that what was needed for developing countries to achieve prosperity was to distribute property rights, and then once people had property rights over their houses or wherever they lived, in shanty towns and even in very poor communities, they could use that as collateral to borrow money from banks and then lift themselves by the bootstraps. That didn't work. It was tried and it didn't work. The World Bank has tried work in that area and it doesn't work. It's simply because those people are poor. If you're poor, it's because you don't have assets. And having property rights over your house in a shanty town will not allow you to use that as collateral, because if you lose the house, you're on the street. And it's very plausible that you will lose the house. More than 80% of small firms fail in the first 2 years. That's a universally known statistic. But the second point is, the argument that you don't need to go to the IMF because you can borrow from your poor is simply wrong. The poor don't have dollars. You go to the IMF because you want dollars. So the poor might even have domestic currency, which they don't. That's the reason why they're poor, and the hint is in the name. But they definitely, absolutely, and completely do not have dollars, and if you're going to the IMF, it's because you have a currency crisis. That is your problem. So the problem is how to generate dollars in the economy, not how to capture money from the poorest people in the society. Education and development. Education is important for a number of reasons. It is a human right. It skills the labor force. It allows people to contribute at a higher level of productivity to the development of society. All that is very good, and education has to be provided to the population of the country. But simply providing education, and once again, this has been a World Bank priority for many decades, that does not resolve the problem, because it's not just a matter of skilling up the population, it's where are they going to work? And this is the phenomenon that several developing countries have experienced. You put an enormous amount of investment into education, and what you get is engineers who become taxi drivers. And you do not need to invest that enormous amount of money to skill up a taxi driver. So the problem is, as you are skilling up your population, what kind of investment are you making or incentivizing or articulating or making sure takes place on the demand side to generate employment for those people? And those two things have to move together. If one of them is out of sync with the other, your economic development strategy is not going to work. So both sides need to be looked into. Nation and global capital. The nation state is where political power lies. And without political intervention, there is very limited scope for substantive change in society. The state is a site of legitimacy. The state is the center of a network of institutions. The state centralizes resources. The state is where people look up to when they have significant general problems in society. So intervention at that level, I think, is indispensable. That is where legitimacy will lie. If significant countries make significant changes, they can have a global impact. So people look around and find inspiration. And when a significant number of countries, even if they are poor countries, move in a certain direction or propose measures at the level of the global economy, they can have an impact. Now, the international is a domain of absolute savagery. And it is the confrontations at that level are absolutely pitiless. And we can see the example recently in the war taking place in Ukraine and all the geopolitical maneuverings around disputes between the US and China. It is a wild field where you have to stand up very soberly and aware of your limitations and try not to overextend yourself. But without that political intervention centered at the level of the state, I'm not sure it would be possible to have an anchor for political transformation and then for economic transformation as well.
More questions? Okay, حضرتك.
Hi, my name is Dori. I come from Indonesia. So right now, we are the largest nickel producer in the world. So nickel is a very critical component for the electrification in the future. That is a critical component of batteries. We lost World Trade Organization's case against the EU in October because they want to have access to raw materials. And the Indonesian government decided that since we have this opportunity, we want to ban the export of raw materials and build industry in creating batteries and introduce technology into the country. So the question is, how do you actually deal with an international system that is actually put a very barrier against the developing countries, right? So how do you deal with that?
Okay. وراك. There's translation.
اتفضل يا يعني أنا كنت عايز أسأل البروفيسور الفريدو يعني ببساطة يعني عشان كده هتكلم بالعربي يعني هو سؤال فلسفي محوري. أيوه أيوه على ما عندك.
Sorry about my linguistic incompetence. Apologies.
It's okay. It's okay. بسأل البروفيسور الفريدو يعني ببساطة شديدة جدا يعني أنا السؤال حضرني في يعني في نفس هذا الوقت يعني في السيمينار نفسه يعني إن أنا بسأل في ظل تطاحن الكبار كيف يستقيم بنا الحال نحن الدول النامية إذا كان الكبار يتسارعون بهذا الشكل في أزمات متطاحنة تتحالف فيها قوى الطبيعة مع القوى الصناعية أو المخلقة أو في أزمات من بداية القرن 21 يمكن من سنة 2001 أزمات متتالية غير يعني مسبوقة يمكن بتذكرنا بأوائل القرن السابق لكن في ظل يعني أوبئة مخلقة أو غير مخلقة في ظل كوارث طبيعية زي الزلزال بتاع تركيا أنا يعني بشوف صورة قاتمة عشرية شديدة السواد يعني أنا بسأل كيف يستقيم الحال بنا إذا كان الكبار لا يراعون نسب التضخم لشعوبهم إذا كانت شعوبهم تئن تحت وطأة هذا الواقع الشديد الظلام فيعني أنا بس عايز يعني البروفيسور يجاوبني على الحتة دي بس شكرا.
ورا خالص.
The mic is it working? So I have a question. It's really on the abstract level. So we've established that neoliberalism doesn't really work. And in the wake of the financial crisis, you really need to focus on the long-term sustainability in favor of short-term profits. So basically, we know where we need to go, but the question is, how do we get there? And the transition is what I feel that I'm missing. Thank you.
Okay. We've had three now.
Sure. I thank you for your example of the case of Indonesia. I don't know this example, but it is very symptomatic of a global economic system that is stacked against the aspirations of developing countries. Two things on this. Developed countries have imposed on the rest of the world a set of rules of behavior and limits on economic policy that they themselves did not follow when they were growing. And this is a fundamental paradox of neoliberalism, that the things I instruct you to do, I preach to you, I impose on you as a developing country, are not the things that I did to get to the position where I am. That is fundamentally unfair. And there are countless examples, and we can go back down to the 19th century for sure, to see a succession of examples. Now, if Indonesia's industrial policy, in the case of nickel, was to achieve verticalization, so the internalization of successive links on the value chain, leading up perhaps to the production of batteries themselves and maybe electric cars, that is absolutely correct. And this is what developing countries have to do. And this is what South Korea did and was very successful, extraordinarily successful doing that. This is what China is doing today and many other countries too. And this is the core of industrial policy. How to identify your strengths and then how to internalize successive links on production chains so that value stays in your country. Instead of simply joining global value chains at the extreme level of the low end of the value added and then stay there and then hope that something magical will happen and the country will develop. It will not. Simply a passive acceptance of those economic policies generated and preached by the West will not be sufficient. Now, there is work on the spaces within the WTO system that are available to developing countries and how to maneuver around those regulations in order to achieve industrial policy goals. This is not work that I have done, it's work that lawyers in particular have done, and that work is valuable and it may be worth having a look at that field. We can talk about it separately later. So it is a challenge, but there is space there. And in any case, the WTO system is under severe strain these days, so there may be even more spaces to exploit. Forgive me if I didn't get all aspects of your question, but we can talk about it later. But what I could capture was if the biggest countries in the world are struggling, what hope is there for developing countries to succeed? We have experienced a succession of crises. This is correct. We have been battered by the COVID-19 pandemic. The global economy was in an anemic state since 2007, 2008, and it's now gone downhill from there. So the situation is really serious. The example of the earthquake in Turkey and Syria is very touching, and the meagerness, the stinginess of the support offered by the advanced economies in the West to the populations that have been victimized is absolutely shocking. The UK government, for example, has promised, unless I am mistaken, please correct me, the UK government has promised £5 or £6 million in support, matched funding. So the Disasters Emergency Committee has to raise an equivalent amount of funds, and then the UK government will match those funds up to £5 or £6 million. This is absolutely nothing. If you consider how many billion pounds, 20, maybe 35 billion pounds was spent in personal protective equipment and COVID tests during the pandemic and other COVID relief measures within the economy itself to offer to populations of countries that have lost 25,000 plus of their own because of the earthquake, that is absolutely unconscionable. It's a clear example of a global system that does not work. And to expect that this global system will respond to climate change with greater generosity, with technology transfer, with payments coming from the West that benefited from growth and emitted the carbon gases that are now causing global warming around the world, that the West will take responsibility and pay for that, that is not going to happen. Not spontaneously, not without a significant amount of pressure. Not simply by waiting and saying, please, we deserve that. No, this will have to come as a result of a significant amount of political pressure put on those countries. So all that suffering will not in itself lead to political change. That will have to be turned into working and functioning social movements. And that is, I think, exactly the question that the colleague at the back had asked. How do we get there? We might have some idea of where we want to go, but how do we get there? I don't think there is a general answer to this, and I don't think this is an answer that can be found in an academic environment any more than it can be found anywhere else. Academics, we have such a privileged position as social scientists, as informed observers, as interested parties, and we can talk about things. But the answers in practice, they will come from experience. They will not come from academic meetings. They will come from experiences of success. We have to try and keep trying, and all of us ought to engage in social movements of one sort or another and try to intervene to make real those ideas that we have in our own mind and act to those ideas and then see what happens. And the experiences, in most cases, we are going to fail. It's a history of failure. But at some point, we are going to succeed. And those experiences of success other colleagues can learn from those experiences and pass them around globally. So it is a process of attempts and failures and then eventually successes, where academics and intellectuals have no particularly privileged position at all. We're just activists and informed observers and participants, just like everybody else. And then what we can do is draw lessons from experiences of success, make those lessons systematic, and try to speak to other people. That is the difference that we can make. It's a very important difference. It's a very important role. But the change itself is not going to come from us. And the prescription is not going to come from us. So the challenge is big, and all we can do is engage with it.
Shall we take 3 more questions? حضرتك. Okay, بعين حضرتك. بعين ورا. الميكروفون عند الأستاذ هنا.
Thank you for excellent lecture. Please, I will speak in Arabic. في ظل المشاكل والأزمات العالمية اللي احنا مرينا عليها والعالم كله، اتولدت نوع من الفوضى في القواعد السياسية والاقتصادية والاجتماعية حول العالم جميعا. وسيادتك أشرت في السؤال السابق إلى أن في دراسات بيتم عملها ومحاولة لإيجاد نتائج. Finally, أنا أحب أسأل إيه نظرات سيادتك المستقبلية للمستقبل للتنمية والاقتصاد العالمي؟ يعني هل هيظل يعتمد على الشركات العالمية الجماعية أم بقى الفردية أم شكل آخر من التعاون الاقتصادي في ظل التغيرات اللي بتحصل وفي ظل اختلاف التوازنات في القوى سواء القوى السياسية أو العسكرية؟ فأرجو يعني إن أنا أفهم الملامح القادمة لهذا النظام الاقتصادي العالمي، وشكرا.
هنا
أولا بس في حاجة مهمة أحب أقول للبروفيسور إن موضوع التجربة والخطأ ده خلاص زمنه انتهى. نحن في زمن التكنولوجي. عليك أن تحلل الواقع، تتنبأ بالمستقبل، تتخذ القرار الصحيح من أول مرة وفي كل مرة، وبالتالي كلام حضرتك قديم. النقطة الثانية، حضرتك بتتكلم هناك فرق بين الفقر وصناعة الفقر. الدول النامية يصنع لها الفقر وليست فقيرة، بمعنى من خلال أن الدول المتقدمة تتحكم في النظم السياسية لتوجيهها توجيه خاطئ بهدف إفقار مجتمعاتها واستغلال تلك للحفاظ على نفوذها، وبالتالي نحن في بعد آخر. أما بالنسبة للتطور التكنولوجي القائم جعل المعلومات تقريبا متوافرة، لا يوجد سر في العالم، وبالتالي مشكلتنا مع أجيال اتولدت أثناء التباطؤ التكنولوجي وهي لا زالت تسيطر على مقاليد السياسة. إذن المشكلة سياسية وليست اقتصادية في المقام الأول. النقطة الثانية، اللي اتولد في الطبقة التكنولوجي عليه أن يجلس في صفوف المتفرجين ويترك من اتولدوا أثناء التسارع التكنولوجي، لأن زي بالبلد عربية 28 ما هتسبق البي ام. موضوع قضي الأمر، نحن في زمن آخر ببعد آخر. حل الأزمات دايما يكون بالابتكار والرؤية، دايما فيجن وانوفيشن أو ابتكار ورؤية بشكل دائم ومستمر. وبالتالي أنا آسف بس حضرتك اتكلمتني محاضرة بشكل كلاسيكي قديم لا يتناسب مع التطور التكنولوجي الموجود. شكرا.
شكرا. هنا اوكي نيجي.
Thank you, sir. It was a pleasure listening to you. I have a question. I mean, you made a very scathing attack on the existing political system in the world and the people who are governing it. But my question to you, sir, would be, who are the other countries in the world do you think could take leadership in providing an alternative system that the earlier person had spoken about? In this context, I would also like you to evaluate the functioning and the prospects of other institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, which the other countries are trying to push. Thank you very much.
طب ناخد الثلاثة دول وبعد هنيجي الناحية دي. ممكن we've had 3 questions.
Okay. What's going to happen to the world economic system? I think we are really at a very difficult situation, at an impasse. There has been one, maybe 2 great stagnations before. One at the very end of the 19th century, and one during the 1970s, perhaps 1980s, and for some developing countries into the 1990s, or maybe they never even recovered. And those previous periods of long stagnation ended in different ways. They ended through technological change back in the 19th century. They ended through the rise of neoliberalism since the 1970s. We don't know how this one is going to, or what this one is going to lead to. The other difficulty that we have is that on the one hand, we are institutionally, most countries not all countries, but most countries in the world are locked into a neoliberal economic system that has conditioned its own institutions in such a way that it is very difficult to make political change. So think of the European Central Bank, for example. European Central Bank has institutional, legal, absolute autonomy. It imposes economic policies. It enforces a particular rate of interest that is embedded within a series of treaties that limits the scope for governments in the European Union to adopt independent economic policies. There's very little possibility of margin for maneuver there. And this type of experience is replicated to many other countries. So even if we can have many ideas about an alternative set of policies, it is very difficult, as a colleague had pointed out correctly there, to see how we're going to get there because of this lock of the institutional structure of neoliberal institutions. Independent central banks, inflation targeting systems, maximum fiscal deficit rules, and in some cases laws, in some cases even constitutional limits on fiscal spending, and privatizations that have been accomplished, regulation of industry that is structured in a very neoliberal way, financialization embedded into the legislative structure of countries, and so it's very difficult to come out of this. But come out of this we must, because evidently neoliberalism has not delivered. The other aspect of the urgency of this problem is, of course, the limits that are imposed on us by the carbon budget and the urgency to address the problem of climate change. So we do have an urgent incentive to address the institutional problems. Now, the institutional problems can only be resolved with political decisions. And for political decisions, we go back to the issue of political participation, intervention at the state level. So it is difficult, but it has to be done. It has to be done at the national level as a way to change the global economic system. It would be very difficult to achieve change in any other way. Time of technology. Technology is the future. This is correct. And technological change, significant technological change has taken place, particularly in areas connected to communications, the internet, and to some extent transport as well. And that has spread around computing power and changes in production. There's talk of this fourth industrial revolution. Who knows if that means anything at all. Advanced economies control that. And interestingly, if you look at the distribution of the significant companies in the world today, all of them are centered in the United States. The European Union is now aware, belatedly, I think, that, hey, we don't have anything. Of all the core centers of innovation, the core industries innovating, and the biggest companies in the world today, the European Union doesn't have them. And that is a significant problem, restoring the capacity of the United States to centralize, if not dominate the economy through its sheer size as it could 50 years ago, but at least to dominate the nodes of the global economy. Then the explanation for the recent aggressive US policies against technology transfer to China and attempts to control chip production and so on. This is a political problem, indeed, but it is also an economic problem because this restructuring of the global system and the new technologies that have been generated, they are embedded within a neoliberal economic system. These are not technologies, in many cases, that have served directly to improve living standards. They have served to generate fortunes to specific monopolies centered in the United States. This has created a generational problem as well. We have a young generation that is growing up in a very different way certainly from my own generation. A young generation that is growing up in a very globalized way with immediate access to information technologies and to the internet, and with social networks that span the world. And the flow of information is very, very different from what it was in my own time. But this process of global integration, particularly of the youth, is an imperfect process. It is far from complete. And this has not led to the emergence yet of a global citizenship. So this will happen in time. My concern there is that we don't know if we have that time. So how can we push this process, steer this process, nudge this process of global integration and cultural exchange and cultural integration in a constructive direction in order to address urgent problems of the world today, in order to build a more equal world, in order to build a sane world, in order to build a world that can address the challenges of climate change in particular, but also the other challenges of neoliberalism, the challenge of distribution, the challenge of equality, the challenge of citizenship, the challenge of global equality of human beings around the world, instead of the strengthening of borders, instead of politics of exclusions, instead of politics of confrontation, politics of grievance that have been emerging with the new forms of authoritarianism. So technology gives us a tool, but it doesn't give us the answer. The problem is, how are we going to use those tools in a constructive way? So which countries are going to take leadership? How about NDB, Belt and Road, etc.? I think NDB is a very good initiative because it fits within a broader context of South-South cooperation, South-South integration. So the answer is not to say, in my opinion, to say, we don't like the world that was built around US hegemony. We want the hegemony of somebody else because we don't like the US. Who could it be? Well, it can only be, realistically, it can only be China in the world today. So we must therefore support the rise of China. That's the wrong answer to the wrong question. The question will be, how do we build a more multipolar, more equal, more democratic world in which small countries can have a voice and bigger countries can provide example and resources to support global development? That is a much more interesting question, I think. And it is a challenge because, as I mentioned before, the realm of international politics is a realm of pure power. It's a realm where countries go in very aggressively a lot of the time in order to defend whatever interests that they might have. So a global political system that is more decentralized, that is more equal, that is based on a greater input from the countries in the global south, that is one that I would support, and I think this one could offer more creative alternatives that respond to the interests of the 80% of the global population that is poor, that lives in poor countries. That is, I think, a more fruitful area for us to invest in.
Thank you. Shall we have another round of questions?
Yes. Hello. So my name is Matilde. I have two questions which are related to climate, and you've talked a bit about it already, but my first question is, we know that it's not a lack of money in the world, right, for the green shift, for also like loss and damage and adaptation, the need for that will only increase, but we know that the money is there. We put a lot of money into the military. If we just used a fraction of that for the green shift and for climate, it would have been enough. We used a lot of money on building out new fossil fuels, looking for more fossil fuels, big highways, building, in my opinion, the wrong infrastructure, the infrastructure that's not the infrastructure of the future. But then we don't seem to be able to mobilize the money into the right projects. And when it comes to climate finance, the money that is put on the table by a lot of developed countries is put on the table, or it's taken from the aid budgets, right? So it's you give money to good projects, but it's taken instead of education aid or instead of health aid or other things. So my first question is, how can we mobilize new finance, right? That's the goal of the Paris Agreement, to mobilize new finance. And then my second question is, what's your take on financialization of nature and climate? Because you have green bonds, you have lots of public-private partnerships, privatization, and now with the new nature agreements, biodiversity agreements, they're also trying to put a price on nature, right? Like put a price on plants and animals and see how we can put them into the calculations and the budgets when you're building new stuff or destroying nature. So I hope that question made sense, or both of them. So basically, how do you find the money, and what's your take on the system we already have, basically? Because you say we need system change, but what does that mean exactly?
Thank you. Whereas I think empowering people is very important, and I wouldn't ever blame engineers and architects for studying, because actually a very big percentage of the engineers and architects, I'm one myself, are paying for their education. So I would just think or recommend that the focus is not deviated from empowering people, but more focus should be put on giving them the due opportunities, because many of those who get very well educated just go abroad to work, and they do very well abroad. So it's not that they only work in simple tasks here. The other thing is perhaps maybe because we are at a time of peace and we have a big army, so the army is taking a lot of tasks which the normal people can share. I think the distribution of tasks may help. Thank you.
Yeah, هنا سهى.
So I'm going to ask about the future of work. You hear that phrase a lot, and I think coming out of the COVID-19 crisis, you heard that work, I mean, in terms of the future of work, work is not going to look the same. But then it's been a couple of years, and what it actually looks like is changes to the structure and the work of what are mostly white-collar jobs. So basically, more flexible terms for people who are in the offices, more flexible working hours, less office presence, and so on. But I remember hearing that work will look different in general for everybody, but it doesn't seem that way. It doesn't seem like there's going to be that shift. And I think if there's one lesson we need to learn from COVID is how do we prevent such crises from really affecting people who are in the informal economy, people who don't have those social safety nets to fall back on.
Okay. This is a difficult round. let me start with the climate change questions. I think you had more than two. But anyway, I think you're absolutely correct. The global financial system and financial institutions, because of the short-termist logic of financial institutions in a time of neoliberalism and financialization, they have been continuing to lend significant amounts of money for additional oil exploration and additional physical infrastructure of the fossil economy that we know and they know will have to be stranded, will have to be abandoned, will have to be not just mothballed and preserved for another time, will have to be destroyed as part of a green transition worldwide. And they're still funding it because if they don't fund, then the next bank will, and for the next quarter, the profits, etc. So it is a vicious circle that is locking in even well-intentioned institutions and governments. And this is completely unacceptable. But you are correct. This is what is taking place. It is also true that a lot of the resources being transferred to the Global South on account of climate change have been taken from the aid budget. So the aid budget hasn't increased, it's just the responsibilities have become even more heavy on the developing countries. How do you find new finance? There are two ways to find new finance. One, and I think this has to be the central way for the majority of countries, it's domestic finance. Countries have to address their own problems themselves and not expect significant amounts of support coming from abroad. That has to be the first layer of the response. And the way to find additional resources domestically is fundamentally through taxation. You need to get those resources from where those resources are and from people who have benefited inordinately from their own individual prosperity and from the concentration of income in the previous period, particularly the rich. And that is important not only because the rich have more that can and should be mobilized, but also because the consumption of the rich is much more, immeasurably more carbon intensive than the consumption of the poor. So when you tax the rich, you're doing two things. You're raising resources to address problems of climate change and address mitigation measures that have to be taken. You're also reducing carbon consumption. You're reducing the amount of business class travel. You're reducing the number of SUVs that are available to buy. You're reducing, compressing a whole lifestyle that is incredibly destructive from the point of view of the earth as a whole, and that cannot be generalized. Not everyone can live as well around the world. Not everyone can live as well as the prosperous part of the population of the United States or any of the advanced economies. We can't. And there are no technologies in sight that would allow us to do that. So the world has to settle at a much more humble level, particularly in the advanced economies where consumption is disproportionately wasteful from a global perspective. You increase the consumption of the poor around the world, there is very, very little climate impact, and there's data on this. You compress the consumption of the rich in the rich economies, and there's a significant climate impact. That's where most of the answer will lie. The other aspect of the resource problem has to come from transfers. There's again no way to escape this. If you look particularly at the problem of small economies in the global south that depend disproportionately on the production and export of oil, what kind of future are we pointing to those economies? Because we are saying very, very clearly, you have to divest from oil. You have to close down the oil industry. You have to close down gas exploration. But some of these countries are very small and have no other option, no other competitive viable export industries. What are you going to do to them? There has to be a period of transition, and this period of transition will have to be shielded and funded largely by the global north. Now, so far the track record on this evidently is abysmal, and there's nothing on the cards that will lead to a significant change, but the response has to be on those directions. Financialization of nature. That is absolutely not the answer. This has been tried, it has been attempted. It leads to profit by financial institutions. They're laughing all the way to their quarterly reports, and there's absolutely no indication that any of this, attributing prices, creation of global carbon markets, and it doesn't make any difference. No difference at all. It just greenwashes the climate crisis problems. So that is not, so the solution is raise resources, address the problem head on, close down the fossil fuel economy, and accelerate the green transition. There's no alternative to this. So system change will mean this green transition, but to make it possible to move into this green transition, we have to transition away from neoliberalism as well. We have to transition away from financialization, because under neoliberalism, under a financialized global system, there will be no green transition. We can sit down and wait for COP after COP. There will be no solution coming from this setup. We've tried for more than 20 years. We have not moved. And even in the countries that have achieved successes in terms of carbon reductions, and some countries have achieved success. If you look at the United States or the UK, they have achieved success in terms of carbon reduction. How did they achieve success? By exporting their industry to the other side of the world. They did not cut their consumption. They simply dislocated their industry. And that was not even voluntary. It just happened. Now, that is not a solution. But even if you look at the countries that did achieve some success, some considerable success, you look at Denmark, that has achieved success. Cuba has achieved success. You replicate those successes around the world, you still don't achieve the green transition. So we are not on track by any stretch of the imagination, and we do need to think outside the box and try different alternatives. Empowerment of people, absolutely, and education is absolutely central for this. You cannot have power without understanding, and understanding comes from education, understanding comes from interaction with other people, comes from the exchange of ideas, and there will be different interpretations of the world, and this is fine. People will always be different, and they will have different opinions, but it is fundamental that we have an education system that is geared to producing rational circumstances for debate, that is geared to producing citizens that can accept differences of opinion, can live with those differences of opinion, but can also accept certain limits to what is acceptable for argument. You cannot invent things. That is a fundamental requirement for debate. You cannot simply declare, I believe that the earth is flat, and that's it, and cut off debate around the reality of the evidence to the contrary. You have to have a rational terms for debate, that it is the process of education, schooling, interaction, exchange, respect for the evidence that the experience of education provides to all of us. So we all hope that people will become educated and that they will not go abroad. It is a very easy route. Like, once again, take the example of the UK. You have a crisis in nursing, lack of nurses in the national health system in the UK. What's the first solution you do? Do you open another university with nursing courses? No. You charter a flight and bring nurses from the Philippines, bring nurses from Sri Lanka, bring nurses from the other parts of the world. This is monstrous. This is monstrous. But look, it's an opportunity for the individual who may have economic advantages that they wouldn't have otherwise, and they can help their family, etc. But from the point of view of national policy, it's a disaster. You get a poor country funding education, a highly skilled profession for their citizens, and then they move away. It's just a total waste. And it is criminal policy on the part of the advanced economies that do this as a matter of course. It shouldn't happen. It absolutely shouldn't. Army taking up tasks, yeah, that is true. In my own case of Brazil, under the presidency of Jair Bolsonaro, several thousand military officers were drafted into positions in the civil service for which they have neither training nor expertise nor capacity to perform, and they were there just by virtue of corporatism, just by virtue of chubbyism, clubism, and political preference on the part of the presidency. Now, people have to be skilled in the job they're set out to do. The COVID response in Brazil was led by the military. It's an absolute disaster. What military? You're trained to do a particular thing, basically kill people. What is it about saving people? You don't know anything about that. You don't know anything about providing oxygen and providing equipment to hospitals. It's not because you're a bad person. It's not your skill. So get the people who know what they're doing to do the job. But of course, around certain political priorities for the country as a whole. Future of work. This is a very, very important question. And I understand what you're saying about things looking more like the same than many of us expected they would look. And I was one of the people who during the pandemic thought, wow, we're not going to go back to where we were before. We are not going to go back to the office because we don't need to. And from the point of view of the companies, they can just sell their office space. And what we're going to have is a massive problem of empty office buildings that then will have to be reconverted into apartments, etc. So that was the world that I was envisioning. In fact, most of it didn't happen. There is more flexibility at work, yes, and people don't always in offices have to go back every day, but the discipline effect took precedence. And a lot of employers demand now that their employees come back into the office, not out of productivity concerns, but out of the disciplining aspect of being in the office, and I can now see what you're doing. It's control. It's not focusing on efficiency. So I don't know where this is going to go. There are different imperatives, and we do have the technology that would allow people to work from home. Working from home is marvelous. I work from home most of my time, but at the same time, we have to be aware of one of the implications, particularly for people who have to do more routinized and disciplined work than most of us have to do, which is the colonization of your house by the employer, the colonization of your housing space by the company for which you work, the last space where you could seek refuge. But in the past, remember, you could go home and you were out of contact. And then there was the mobile phone, and the mobile phone allows you to be reached wherever you are. And now the work itself goes into your home, and they know when you are in front of your computer. Right? The employer knows. They have the mechanisms to know. They know when you're not logged on. They know when you're checking your Facebook account. They know when you go to the kitchen to prepare a cup of tea. This is really dangerous in terms of individual autonomy and our capacity to isolate ourselves from the employment relation. My God, you go to the beach and they can call you now. And in the past, some of you of my age will remember the time when you walked outside of that door and nobody knows where you are. You're uncontactable. And now this is no longer true. So I think work will change, but it's not clear in what direction this is going to evolve. How to protect populations from crises, as the example of COVID has shown. I think the best type of policy that was implemented is universal policies. Policies that provide general benefits to everyone and protect everyone, regardless of employment position, just by virtue of them being human. If you exist, you're a member of society, we value you, and we don't want you to die from COVID, and we don't want you to starve while you're self-isolating for the benefit of everyone else. So self-isolation, quarantines, etc., they were for the benefit of the other people, not just for your own benefit, saving you from COVID, for the benefit of everybody else, because you're not going to be coughing on public transport, not coughing on the street and in the office and passing on a virus that could be, in most cases, it was not significant, but in some cases could be lethal or could lead to long-term health complications for most people. So universal policies, universal transfers, universal benefits on the basis of the fiscal power of the state to tax from those who have and benefit those who need. And the fiscal power of the state to create resources that can be paid for in the future or don't need to be paid for at all because they generate additional employment. This is well established within economic theory, and it is not done more frequently because politics prevents it from happening. Politics, the constraints of our neoliberal political system, a neoliberal economic system, prevent states from adopting policies that would benefit more people as opposed to benefiting particularly those who are already very rich. And this is a distortion that needs to be addressed.
Dr. Filio, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Hiba. You've been very patient with me. Thanks, everyone, for coming and sacrificing your evening. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.